So my provocation today really is just to say that prosperity, or sustainable prosperity, is certainly the biggest task we face at the moment. It's the biggest challenge in the world for us. Now, standards of living, of course, have been rising globally in the last 20 years, but so too has social inequality. And the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2008 means that millions of people have their livelihoods threatened all around the world, even in the richest countries like this one. We're also in a situation where we have widespread dissatisfaction with institutions of government, of finance, of business, and even of international cooperation. And the dominant perception we all have is that there's been a heedless pursuit of profit, pursued at the expense of environment, the well-being of the majority, and social values in general. So in a way, the population of the planet seems to be on a collision course with its future. And so what might be then the answer to that problem? Well, we've had various ideas put forward, and lots of people are actually working on these issues. So why do we want a returned attention or a renewed attention to prosperity now? Well, I think what the issue is that we are still living in a fantasy space. We're still thinking that we're somehow going to go back to business as usual. So when the crisis has finally passed, when austerity has stopped, when Mr. Osborne has stopped saying that everything is basically all right and growth has returned, what do we plan to do? Well, we plan to enhance the prosperity of societies around the world globally by going back to precisely what we were doing before. The question is, can we go back to what we were doing before? And I'm sure that all of you in this room think that we cannot. And that is indeed my view too. So the Institute for Global Prosperity begins with that. No chance of going back. So we have to go forward. And if we have to go forward, then what is that going to look like? So why prosperity now? Why it should matter? And why does it matter for UCL? What are we going to do about this challenge here in UCL? So my first question to you then is, let's start with something quite simple. Do you in this room feel prosperous? Are you feeling prosperous right now as you stand here listening to me? Don't you feel that something of prosperity has been lost? And can you put your finger on what it is that we've lost? Now, of course, some people never had prosperity at all. With all the technological developments and the economic growth that's been around in the last 50 years, we're still in a situation where we have 7 billion people living on the planet, and 3 billion of them, not quite half of those people, live on less than $2.50 a day. That's less than the cost of a cappuccino at the next door Costa that you all go to. And of course, 1 billion of them live on less than $1 a day. And yet it's not just them. We don't feel prosperous in Europe either. And what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that something's gone wrong with our ideas of what will bring about prosperity. So what should we do about this? Well, 10 things we need to know about prosperity. It isn't just wealth. It isn't just growth in the economy. It can't be measured by GDP alone. It is about flourishing, about the health of society, about inclusive political institutions. It's about the guarantee of civil liberties. It's about human capital development and, of course, an educated and healthy citizenry of all kinds. Now, why are we having so much problem attaining those goals? We know what the problems are, so what's holding us back? Well, Tim Jackson has argued really rather nicely that part of our problem is that we are still fixated on growth. We talk about having given up growth, but that isn't actually the situation we're in. His point is that we can't go on having infinite growth on a finite planet, and that growth has to be curtailed, even in high-income countries, if we are to attain the carbon emission reductions that we so much need. So in a sense, we have to plan for low growth. But we've never really wanted to plan for low growth, have we? Now, the good news, or the bad news, depending on how you look at it, is that now we don't have any choice. The growth in the global economy is uneven and sluggish. Madame Lagarde calls it the new mediocre. That's where we're going to be from now on. The forecast for global growth for this year and next is about 1%. And the IMF has actually revised its forecasts for growth in the emerging markets, who've been doing very much better than Europe. They've revised their targets for the emerging markets 6 occasions since 2011. So there's been a consistent process of downward revision of even what those parts of the world that are doing well will actually be able to do. Now, interestingly, that means that China's GDP will go down next year, possibly down to about 6.8. It means that Brazil's, which is supposed to be one of the countries which is driving for the development of the BRICS, will actually be at 0.3 next year. So the new normal is going to be low growth. Now, whether this is something that is to be welcomed or something that is not to be welcomed depends a little bit on people's ideological positioning. But what it probably means for all of you who are beginning your careers is it will be low growth for the next 60 years. So for all of your working life, this is going to be the situation. That situation will not change. So how can we begin to think about what that might mean? Well, one of the ways that we've been fixated on growth is, of course, talking about gross domestic product and GDP. And we're still fixated on GDP, even with all the new work on well-being, satisfaction, hope, aspiration, flourishing of human societies, and so on. And so when we look at GDP, what does it tell us about where we are with our fixation on growth? Well, Nigeria revised its GDP earlier this year, in fact, in April. So it entered some new assumptions into the figures and then divided them by the number they'd first thought of. And the result of this was that GDP in Nigeria went up by 89%. But not a single one of Nigeria's citizens were any richer the day after this was announced than they were the day before. The majority of their 170 million citizens are still living on less than $1.25 a day. Now, the UK, as you may all know, revised its growth figures for its GDP last week, and it went up significantly, UK GDP. And why did it go up? Well, it went up for a variety of reasons, but mostly because it was buoyed up by the inclusion of drug dealing and prostitution in the figures. Perhaps no surprise then, at the same time that the economy has been revised up, household incomes have actually been revised down. So GDP is going down, GDP is going up, but household incomes are going down. There's a sort of crisis in the standard of living. In fact, several commentators have pointed out that this is the longest and deepest squeeze on average real earnings in the United Kingdom since reliable records began in the mid-19th century. For example, if we look at pay, now we know there's a great deal of discussion about pay, but pay is important in this equation. So last year, the FTSE 100 directors, their pay went up by 21%, while average wages in the UK failed to keep pace with inflation. Today, CEOs in the United Kingdom earn 120 times more than the average full-time employee. 120 times more than the average full-time employee. So not the least well-paid, but the average employee. What's interesting about that is it's 120 times more compared to 2000, which is only 15 years ago, when it was only 47 times more than the average paid employee. And if we look at what's happened in the recession, we see that people who are poorer are, of course, hit harder by recession, harder by having resources cut back. So this little graph here shows you that if you look at how inflation has worked by looking at key necessities of life, if you look at how inflation has worked for different incomes groups, you can see the cumulative effect of rising prices for the whole population sort of grouped together in 10% chunks from the richest to the poorest. And over the last 8 years, those on the lowest incomes have experienced substantially more inflation in the cost of living than those on the highest. They have less choice over how they spend their limited funds, and so they directly suffer the rise of the price of essentials much more than those who are better off. So what are the factors that are going to shape prosperity in the future if this is the state we are in? How can the choices we make today affect the opinions of, and the options and choices of future generations? Now, actually, this question isn't at all easy to answer, because while we might agree that sustainable prosperity in the future will be based on 4 kinds of capital, so basically economic, human, natural, and social, we can't absolutely know what will happen to those forms of capital over time. For example, there could be amazing changes in technologies. We might learn to live more efficiently. We might, even most extraordinarily of all, learn how to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. We don't know what technology will bring or the changes it might engender. So far, the only reliable thing that's produced a reduction in carbon emissions globally has been recession. Recession is very good at reducing carbon emission. But the other things that also change over time, which we can't really factor in well enough, are human tastes and aspirations. The definitions of a good life change all the time, and we don't know the kind of lives we'll want to lead in the future. So therefore, talking about future prosperity and what that will mean is hard from the position we're in now. We have to be aware, too, that our understanding of the natural world, the environment and our natural resources all depend on a notion of nature that humans are, in fact, altering all the time. These are natural living systems that we are part of, but humans are intervening in these self-organizing systems in ways that mean that the boundaries between nature, culture, informatics, and the machinic are actually impermeable. I don't know how many of you know that strawberries now have fish genes injected into them so that the fruit is not affected badly by freezing. Very effective. So next time you eat a strawberry, just think about it. So with all these things going on, what's the plan? What's the plan? What do we think we're going to do next? We can't go back to what we were doing before, and we can't use the same kind of thinking we've been using up to now. So we need to do something different. We do know that part of this is going to involve very hard choices. But do we really want to change? Is it just that we are clueless? Why have we had so little traction on making the kinds of changes we want to make? Is it really all about governance and regulation? Is it all about what other people are doing elsewhere? We all know that frustrating sense that you could imagine a world in which you cycle to work, you recycle, you cut your carbon footprint, but you're all very, very well aware that this isn't big enough. This isn't a big enough impact for the kind of level of challenge that needs to be addressed. So what are we going to do? The other difficulty is that not everybody necessarily wants to go on thinking about what the future brings. But we do need to start thinking about how we might revalue the social and economic institutions that make up the world that we inhabit. And how might we go about that? Well, first of all, we're faced, I think, with a future at the moment which often looks rather grim to us. I always often say that when we're told things about climate change, we're mostly told that if we don't do something, that the result is going to be apocalypse. So it's sort of Cormac McCarthy's The Road, that dreadful film, and you're just walking into a nightmare. So actually, the question is, what are the imaginative things we could do? Where could we begin? Where might we look? Are we not already doing some things that might be very helpful? And the answer is, yes, we are. So if we start thinking about what could we do, what shifts in our thinking might be possible? Well, some of them are very straightforward and interesting. For example, this one. This is really a revaluation about what is a house and what does property mean to us. So this is the image of the new floating village on the Royal Victoria Dock in London. Now, this floating village, these are not people living on boats on water. These are people living on houses that float. And that very small difference, that different way in which we interact with the environment by making that small conceptual change is, I think, important. It signals the beginning of something else. Now, you'll all be very well aware that unfortunately, although this floating village was supposed to incorporate large amounts of affordable housing, it looks like it won't, because with every new innovation, not only do the developers want to make more money by producing these houses as high spec, but also with every technological innovation, we're all fixated on the innovative and on the new. And so those who have a lot of resources would like to live on one of these rather cool floating houses, thereby pricing out people who are not able to make those purchases. But thinking about that, I think, raises interesting questions. So let's think about what happens if we change our attitudes to property in general. Now, the crisis, of course, in 2008 began with a debt crisis around mortgages. and around housing. So housing is one of the assets that makes us all attach to growth. It makes us all attach to the idea that we are property owners, that we have assets under our control, and that those assets give us a sense of security. So how could we change those attitudes? Well, there's been some new work done in MIT that suggests that young people are increasingly seeing houses as services rather than possessions. Now, this could be a question of life cycle. I can't remember how I felt about houses when I was in my 20s, but I don't think I paid very much attention to the question of houses. It might be a preoccupation that grows on you as you get older. So it's hard to tell whether these groups of people who are being surveyed will actually change their minds as they get older. But imagine if your house was not a possession, but a service. It would change the way you think about property and whether you think you should hold it. Up to now, in many of the European societies we can think about, owning a house and owning a car has been associated with a sort of freedom, with self-determination and adulthood. Well, imagine if you break that connection and start thinking about these things in a different way. For the generation to come, it's not just that people cannot get on this awful mortgage ladder, but actually one should think about that what does the debt of a mortgage do? The debt of a mortgage, apart from being a gamble, like any other debt that you hold, is actually something where your life is lived in promissory mode. That you're paying for something that's a future that will never arrive. So you're running as hard as you can to carry on paying all these debts. But when in your life is that future going to actually come? So if you released yourself from that psychological preoccupation, would it make a difference? The idea is that in the future, we are already beginning to think about how we share amenities and services of different kinds in different ways, sharing in offices and sharing desks, sharing shops, sharing things which are called fab labs, sharing recreational spaces. And there's a lot of work that suggests that different generations in different parts of the world, particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia, are much more interested in novel modes of sharing and collaboration than they are in holding and owning and possessing things. So could we work with some ideas that are emerging there? The only cautionary note I would say is that in regard with shared spaces, shared desks and shared offices, there isn't really much evidence in most universities that this is desperately popular, but we will try. So there could be a change in attitude towards property and property owning. I think also that there could be a change in attitude to profit. What is profit? Well, businesses are the engines of the economy. They're important. Markets are important. But profit at any cost is not. So we need to change our business models. And how might we go about changing the business model? Well, I think two things are going to happen in business models in the future. The first is that the generation that is coming will not work for businesses that can't demonstrate a commitment to sustainability. So suddenly these businesses are going to find that they're dealing with a whole generation of new employees who want businesses to have a social commitment and will want to inquire into the nature of that social commitment. But I also think that the purposes and outcomes of businesses need to change quite dramatically. And there is some work now going on social value in businesses, which is quite heartening. That is, what is the purpose of a business? Well, to make a profit, to return dividends to shareholders. But suppose we think about the dividends of a business in another way. Suppose we say the dividends of that business have to be social value and the protection of the environment. Suppose we say that in order that the way we think about profit will turn on how much globally a business has contributed to the protection and management of natural assets and social value. That will change business models considerably. Let's think then again about another area where work has already been done, where there are some quite exciting ideas, and that is in the question of what is work. Perhaps we could change our ideas about work. Work is, of course, something that's important to all of us, not least because we are so bound up with work, not only because of the many hours it takes in our lives, but because it forms such a crucial part of our identities. And of course, household income and work are essential components of any definition of well-being. They provide, wealth and income provide people with resources that allow people not only to satisfy basic needs, but to pursue goals in life that are important to them, that give their lives value and purchase. It's important to have a job that matches your aspirations and your competencies. So it's not just a matter of having a job, although having a job is very crucial, but it's a matter of having a good job, the right kind of job. So what is the right kind of job? Well, this week, the UK announced a rise in employment figures. It was another of those statements, recovery is well underway, except that it was also quietly announced that with more people in work, there would be, however, a reduction in income tax receipts. So why is there a reduction in income tax receipts if the number of people in work is going up? Well, you all know the answer to that. There's a great deal of in-work poverty everywhere in the world. It's not that having a job is enough to keep you out of poverty. Many families who have 2 people working are still in poverty. They still can't feed their children at the end of the month. There's a kind of moral scandal involved in that, but there's also a crisis around the centrality of work to who we are and what we do. So we often think that work is more valuable if it's paid. If it's not paid, we don't think it's very valuable. But if it's valuable, if it's paid, it's valuable. The more pay a job attracts, we think it's more valuable. The more a job is paid, the more worthy we think it is of people's time. Makes more sense for them to be doing it. Time is, after all, money. But suppose the value of work was assessed and paid in different terms. And it has been suggested, the New Economics Foundation and others have done some really good work on this, been suggested that actually work should be assessed and paid in terms of its creation of social and environmental value, and in terms of its medium and its long-term effects on society and the environment. So if your job is contributing more to social value and environmental value, you will be paid more. Now that would be a change. Would bankers under that thing be paid more than hospital cleaners? Which would you pay more in such a set of circumstances? Who's contributing more to social value in those circumstances? So work is important, but also let's think about what's happening with cities. We're in one of the greatest cities of the world, right here in the centre of London, and that's an important place for us to be. And we all know that by the year 2050, between 60 and 70% of the world's population will live in cities or in urban areas. But exactly what is a city? Can we change our idea of what a city is? Can we change our idea of what an urban area is, or perhaps of what a street is? Now here is an image of a city that's going to be built in a rural area near Chengdu in China. It's a 1.3 square kilometre city called the Great City, and it will feature a very high-rise core, which you see in the photograph, surrounded by a buffer landscape of open space, which will actually comprise 60% of the total area of the city. It'll have 80,000 residents who will be able to walk from the city centre to its edge in just 10 minutes. The project has been designed to conserve existing farmland, with more than 60% of this 800-acre site preserved for agriculture. And it will be surrounded by this buffer landscape whose natural topography, including valleys and bodies of water, will be integrated into the city itself. So the natural topography of the area is not going to be flattened to shove a new city on top of it. The natural topography of the area is going to be maintained with the city at its core. And the city will use 40% less energy, 58% less water than conventional developments, which can house 80,000 people. It'll produce 89% less landfill and generate 60% less carbon dioxide. Now, that really is a rather remarkable-looking city, and it's a remarkable vision. And there's a lot of work already that's being done on how we might begin to take the steps towards what would be a globally prosperous society. But for us, this is not a matter, really, of trying to foretell the future, but a more difficult task of trying to apply evidence, asking whether we're asking the right questions, asking whether we're operating with the right assumptions. So, for example, when we think about change, how do we envisage change? So history tells us a great deal about the transition from the agricultural to the industrial age. Many of our great historians around the world have been writing precisely about that. But perhaps we should be asking our historians more about the question of how we might imagine the transition from the agricultural and industrial age, which after all most of the world is still in, to the next phase of world history. Equally, we've been very used in the last 2 centuries to the idea that innovations, particularly technological and medical innovations, pass from the developed to the developing world, or from the global north to the global south. Now, this assumption, of course, is not only being challenged very vigorously by the rise of India and China, but also by developments that are taking place in other parts of the world. We need to question this teleological nature of our own thinking. It's just not plausible that all the ideas necessary to drive and enhance sustainable prosperity for the future would arise in the West. It's pure folly to imagine such a thing. We need to be much more imaginatively engaged with projects like this, which are much more innovative than any project we have seen in Europe, for example. I'm very much focusing on this at the moment simply because of the whole question of Ebola. So the global north really ignoring the coming catastrophe of Ebola in Africa, even knowing how it was developed, whilst those in Africa actually developing innovative ways of dealing with it. The global north had no interest in Ebola until it came knocking on its own door, right? And as soon as we think we might have Ebola here, then we start thinking about what we want to do. But we have no interest in thinking about that early or in recognizing what new innovative things were being done in a number of African countries, particularly in Ghana and Nigeria, to respond early on with very few resources to managing this epidemic. Normally, when we hear about this thing in the press here, it's presented as if this is an epidemic that has not been managed or has not had any innovative thinking locally applied to it. But one of the difficulties we have with prosperity is what will happen to us even if we do manage to do many of the things we want to do. And I think we have to think again as well about the dynamic nature of prosperity. To say that we're looking to what a globally prosperous society or societies would look like, we have to recognize that there won't just be one answer to this question, that this is a dynamic process, and that as we create solutions to things, new problems will arise. So, for example, what will happen to manufacturing and to current models of business when we manage to sustainably engineer every component in every part of a manufacturing cycle? So what form will innovation take when we recycle and reuse everything we produce? If we could do that, what would be the negative potential outcomes of that happening? So let me then sort of conclude a little bit. I think that sustainable prosperity is the most pressing problem of the moment. We do need to generate new forms of flourishing in human societies. One of the things that we do have that is produced by education is talent, unique talent. On a global scale, one of the things we could perhaps say is that with rising human capital and education, that intelligence and imagination on this global scale are genuinely new and powerful. And whatever prosperity is going to be about, it's going to be about getting people to participate in designing the future. And this will depend very, very crucially on diversity. Diversity of voices, of approaches, of opinions. Because whatever form prosperity is going to take, it's going to be plural. And diversity of voices is going to mean better ideas. Now, why then are we attending to global prosperity here at UCL? Well, I think that if we are to have any chance of beginning new sets of thinking, drawing on diverse opinions, rigorously assessing evidence, thinking about whether models will really work or not, can they be scaled up? What could be the negative effects of those models? We're going to have to do a number of things. First of all, we need to locate that kind of debate within a global university that has a global reach across the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities. We need a community who are themselves able to use authoritative reasoning with evidence and to do so with authority. We need a space where dialogue, collaboration, and managing dissent and difficulty is already a matter of habit, of cultural habit. And universities, I think, are the perfect space for this. I think that what we want to do here in UCL is to work on and build on the achievements that have already taken place and bring together multidisciplinary teams from across the university to work on key problems that are moments of blockage or difficulty. It means that it will be much more demanding in this space to be an intellectual, because most of us will be outside our comfort zones. But I think that if we're to have any hope of imagining what a future prosperous global society would look like, it's going to mean for all of us that it's going to be much more demanding, not just to be an intellectual, but actually much more demanding to be a citizen. So one of the things I'm going to do today is to announce the Institute for Global Prosperity Challenge for 2015, which is going to be based on London. It opens today. You can link to the website. You can take a poster when you go. What this is about is an example of the kind of thing I've been talking about. So an individual, rather far-sighted individual, worked out that 40% of London is already green space. And so he asked a very simple question. What would it mean to turn Greater London into a national park? Would that make London more prosperous? What would it do for the health and well-being of all the people who come to London, live in London, work in London? And what I'm inviting all of you to do is to get together with people outside your own discipline and address some of these issues. There's a prize, kind of nice prize in the sense of money, prosperity. There's also an opportunity for the winner to co-author the book that's going to come out of this on how London might change if it were to become Greater London were to become a national park. And so I hope that you will all take up this challenge in the most robust kind of way and demonstrate exactly what the community of UCL can do to begin a long discussion about what is going to be the prosperous global future that we are all hopefully going to inhabit. Thank you. Yeah, sure, here and then at the back. Yeah.
Just wonder if you can elaborate a little on the thinking behind locating the institute within a faculty of the built environment. So why Bartlett for this institute?
Well, I think there are several answers to that, but I'll spare the Bartlett's blushes about the obvious answer and simply say that I'm committed in the work that I and others are going to do in the Institute for Global Prosperity to break down the barriers between the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences, to work in a new way. And I think one needs to be located in a space where those kinds of discussions have already taken off to a certain extent. So if you were sitting in the history department, it might be very hard to get engineering to actually talk to you. Or if you were sitting in the anthropology department, it might be very hard to get English literature to talk to you. I think sitting in the Bartlett is a space where those cross currents flow through. Whether they're captured maximally is another point of discussion. But I think that's the main reason. But also because I started my intellectual life working on space. And so it's rather nice to find that as I come to the end of my intellectual life, I'm going to be working in a very similar way on things again, and to be located in the Bartlett. It's a pleasure for me. For people who are unemployed or on very low wages, every pound or every dollar that's earned or every rupee is a net increase and a net benefit. And in those situations, you have many pressures on what you need to do in order to sustain households, yourself, people around you, and so on. But I think that for people who have some degree of choice, as they see it, about careers, if I said to you, which would you prefer to work in? A university that's absolutely committed to doing something about the environment in London and about maximising social and natural value? Or would you like to go and work for this one down the road who doesn't really care about any of those things at all? What you would find is that more people wanted to work for this other kind of university, and that applies, I think, to business. The difficulty here is that we haven't really got robust evidence on this. We have suggestive evidence that this is what's happening in the generation that's coming. And actually, that's one of the things I'm thinking about working on. And I was thinking initially about perhaps doing it with high-end wage earners, particularly, because it's often high-end wage earners who we think have less morals than other people. So, for example, if we think about financiers or bankers, we don't tend to be thinking of those individuals as people who might be green in their souls. We think rather of other things about them. Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know, but I think it would be interesting to look at the top end of wage earners to see whether that evidence can be robustly put into place. But there is quite a lot of suggestive evidence that the next generation think about a job in a different way. So they want satisfaction out of a job. They want a life out of a job. They want a different work-life balance. Actual amounts of money, as long as a certain amount of money is guaranteed for basic needs and well-being, isn't as important. It's not the major driver behind the job. Certainly in my own experience, the only way in which it is successful is by asking people to work collaboratively on a single, very well-defined problem. Because if you just ask them, you know, what should we do about social inequality? You have them all giving their own approaches, their own methods, their own disciplinary backgrounds. And you can be in those meetings for hours and you just come out with a headache and very little result. I think, but if you are, what I'm particularly interested in, and I'll be holding lots of discussions and round tables around UCL. I've already begun, and I'll be doing more and more of those. And also Mary here, who is the postdoc in the Institute for Global Prosperity, will also be convening and holding a sort of postgraduate forum, which will do the same kind of thing. But I think it's about looking for problems which are blockages for several different disciplines, a single problem that's a blockage for several different disciplines, and specifying the problem very clearly. I think that's about it. And I think if we took all the successful initiatives that we know about around the world, of which there are a lot, and all of the successful research, and just put them together in a large pot and said, okay, that's global prosperity, I don't think we would have made any progress forward at all. I think the first thing is there needs to be a new public discussion about what prosperity is, and there isn't really a new public discussion about that. We have had a bit of a public discussion about post-GDP metrics, and a bit of a public discussion about well-being around the world, and more commitment in some countries to it than others. But the moment there's any sign, as there is now, of growth returning, when did anybody mention well-being to you in the last 6 months since the UK economy looks like it's going up? The answer is that all that work on well-being and the work the OECD did, which was very good, has basically fallen out of public view. So I think you need a new public discussion, and that's one thing that UCL should be the engine for, is a renewed public discussion, not just here in Europe, but all around the world, about what global prosperity is, what its multiple forms will take, and how we're going to get there. The next set of work is conceptual, which is why I started with what is a job, what is work, what is profit, etc. We need to change the basis of that conceptually. The next step after that is theoretical. We need to do theoretical work. Now, theoretical work, good theoretical work, can only be done collaboratively. And it therefore means not only that UCL and all of you in this room, as many of you already are, collaborating with other academics all around the world, but much more importantly, it means a new collaborative deal between universities and communities, a completely new collaborative deal with universities and communities, some of which has already been pioneered here in UCL. First of all, in the Development Planning Unit at the Bartlett, and second in the Citizen Science Unit that's run by Mookie Hackley. So there are already work that's being done. That work needs to be at the heart of what comes next. And then after that right, is the particular set of research projects that need to be done, which will themselves have citizen participation in them. There's no way that one can move away from that. And that building up those models is about, prosperity there is inclusive. It's about other people participating in directing their future. And we don't have that situation at the moment. However many transition towns we have, however many great ideas we have, however many projects we know about that have worked on water management in Latin America, however many projects that have worked for rising agricultural incomes in India, you know, whatever that is, and there are many of them, there are many successes around the world, but what do they add up to together? And that's the difficulty, is what will shift the situation. So you've put your finger on the challenge. The question is, how do we do it? But I think that there is something happening. There's just a moment. You see, when you work in the social sciences like I do, you realize that your most successful theoretical contributions have often been when the social sciences catches something of the zeitgeist, something that's happening out there in the world. And that's appropriate for a science that's actually studying a society or societies of which it is a part. That's what the social sciences does. And it studies societies in the natural language of those societies so that they can speak back to the people who are studied. And therefore, you know, there have been immense changes in the social sciences which have caught things that have been happening in society. So one example of that would be the work on gender, for example. It took off in the social sciences when it took off socially, and we drove it. And be careful what you wish for, because when I started working on gender, nobody wanted to work on gender. And now every country in the world has a gender policy, and all sorts of people in government who are supposed to advance it. Whether they do or not is another matter, but you know, it's out there. So I do feel optimistic, but I also feel that surely a university like UCL, a big global university, with all of the resources of a university at your disposal, could you not, surely as a community, make a step change? Could you not? Would you not make a contribution that would have a lasting impact? Right? And it certainly seems to me worth a try. Great, so please come to the next Soundbite.